So there's been a lot of talk in recent years about the male loneliness epidemic. So the idea that men are exceptionally lonely compared to other genders. And so I'm a trainer in connecting communication. I've worked a lot with both men, but also other genders on their loneliness and on how to create deep, emotionally satisfying connections. And so I was very curious about this term and also about, because there's also some pushback, people saying that, well, yeah, that might be an issue for men, but aren't female inequality issues way bigger? I mean, there's femicide, right? There's other issues, and this shouldn't be a diversion. Is this a diversion of that, etc. So I went into the rabbit hole of research. In this video, we're going to look at the facts and the statistics on this, what is behind loneliness in general, and how we can overcome this. And I'm also looking after 4 cats at the moment, which is maybe one way to overcome loneliness. I don't know. So, first of all, how bad is loneliness for our health? So, research has shown that loneliness and social isolation is as unhealthy as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So that's pretty unhealthy, right? Those findings were already done about 15 years ago when researchers started to talk first about an epidemic of loneliness in general. And so the term male loneliness epidemic has come up in the past 5 to 10 years, especially around COVID, it became a bit more. And this doesn't really come from the social science community, but just from the media and blogs on male mental health, etc. And so are men statistically more lonely than women? So research, the most large studies have shown that men and women are kind of equally lonely. So for instance, I'll just note a couple of researchers and I'll link them back below as well. So for instance, a Pew Research Center survey finds that about 16% of Americans say that they're lonely most of the time or all of the time, so really being chronically lonely. And that rate is very similar for men and women. Another report called The Male Loneliness and Isolation, What the Data Shows, observes that over the past decades, the time spent alone for men and women have increased equally, and that their loneliness and the number of close friends, the trends on that are as well quite similar. So this is all American research. I found a European research as well that confirmed this. This was a 15-year-long study from Norway where they looked at loneliness and how it evolves over time. And again, they didn't find many differences between genders. So you might say, well, what about the fact that men are, and I can't really mention this term because then my video won't really go out on YouTube, but you know what I mean? Like when people don't no longer want to be on this planet, those rates are higher amongst men and might in part be linked to loneliness, but also to other mental health issues, obviously. But people might come up with that number, with that fact, right? Statistic fact. But I looked into this as well, and surprisingly, what I found was that actually these numbers are the successful attempts. When you look at the actual attempts that people do to no longer be on this planet, they're either similar or they're actually higher amongst women. But the attempts of women are less often lethal because of the way the methods they use. And there's a lot into that as well. So I want to park that. So one caveat that is important to mention is about how do you measure loneliness, right? What is loneliness? So do you measure the amount of friends someone has? But what does it say about the quality of the friendships? So a lot of studies rely on self-report, so admitting that you're lonely. And now the tricky thing with that is that we might agree that for men it might be more of a, how do you say that, a taboo to admit that they're lonely. So all in all, these numbers still might not reflect reality. So what would like to conclude is that loneliness is an issue for all genders, right? And it's not as important who is slightly more lonely than the other gender, given, what the research shows, I think, as it is to look at why are we lonely and how can we overcome that. And so let's look at that. So why are men lonely? So what some of the surveys show is that although men and women may have about equal amounts of people to reach out to, men don't actually reach out to their friends for emotional support as often as women do. Another thing is that men tend to socialize more in groups than one-on-one. And an assumption here is that when you socialize one-on-one, you're more likely to get actual emotional support, which is an assumption, but I guess that might be true. So this is why, especially around COVID, men might have had a slightly harder time than women because they couldn't do those group activities whereas women might still be able to call a friend and maybe get emotional support that way. Another thing is that there has been an increase in women voluntarily dating cis men less. And so what that means is that men need to rely on friendships more. And as we will see, society prioritizes romantic relationships over other relationships in general. And this is especially problematic for men who might not voluntarily be single. So the reasons women mentioned around no longer wanting to date men are about their lack of emotional availability and the inequality they experience in these relationships. And so there are people who have responded to this notion of the male loneliness epidemic by saying, yeah, women have become too picky, right? They focus on the lack of romantic relationships for men as an explanation for them being lonely, which is already one assumption. And they say that, women are to blame, basically. And I guess that's a very tragic conclusion out of some of these statistics, because this kind of conclusions that are actually contributing to women wanting to date less men, right? I mean, straight women and bisexual women. So let's look at what's actually going on. So let's look at some of the narratives that block men from having better emotional connection. So the narratives that our society teaches men. So firstly, I would say I boiled it down to about the five most important ones. So it's about men having to be self-sufficient. So reaching out is kind of weakness. It's about men having to be non-emotional. I mean, anger is okay, right? But any other emotion doesn't exist and you shouldn't be vulnerable. Then there's an element where I would say that for men, having friendship with other men, you're less allowed to have kind of tenderness or just in general like physical touch. So I think there's a way higher level of homophobia and fear of being perceived as coming on to men. And lastly, I would say that, this was found by research as well, that for men, being the provider and having a career is a more important part of their identity still than it is for women. So being a good friend is not something that gains you any status or that you probably have had any models in as that being a very important part of a successful or satisfying life. And then for the reasons why women are lonely. So for women, research showed that it was mostly about unequal emotional labor. So they've learned to give more than to receive in relationships, which leaves them lonely and depleted. Just like men, they have this pressure around having romantic relationships. They're taught that their self-worth is tied to being picked by ideally a man, which again leads them to invest slightly less into friendships. But this is kind of similar to between men and women, I'd say, although maybe slightly more important for women to be picked, Then research showed that women spend so much more time on caregiving, whether it's for kids, older elderly people, parents, for example, and their partners. So they're socially exhausted. They don't have time for friendships or energy for friendships. Even though, as I talked before, men learn even more to repress their feelings, for women, their assertiveness and anger is repressed, and that might also leave them feeling, I don't know, like give them a sense that they're not a whole human being, they're not fully being seen. And because women live longer, when they date men, they're more likely to be a widow at the end of life, and it might be harder at that point to find friendships. So there's more loneliness amongst women later in life. There's more social comparison between women when they're younger, especially because of social media. So there's more competition between women rather than friendship. And lastly, if that wasn't enough, women have still, like on a worldwide scale, more financial dependency on men. And so when their relationships are not satisfying, they might not always be able to leave. So they might stay in relationships where they actually feel lonely. So how do we overcome this loneliness issue? So based on my background and what I've seen in working with people, I came up with 3 sort of areas to focus on. The first one is that what I've seen is that all genders have quite a high awareness of this, actually. I don't think I mentioned anything that was like completely new for you in terms of those ways that society has conditioned us, especially. And so it's not really about awareness, but it is about a lack of a practice space for new behavior. So if as a man, for example, you want to have more physical touch with your male friends, it's pretty scary to do that all alone, to start doing that and not be misinterpreted because the culture hasn't shifted yet. So we need a sort of in-between space where new behavior can be practiced, where, for example, also as a woman, you can be more assertive and, you can maybe express anger healthily. Like, what does that look like even, right? How does that feel? And so for that, I really recommend doing nonviolence communication. So I called it connecting communication in the beginning because I like that term better, but the official term is nonviolence communication. And so this is where I have courses in, programs in. I recommend joining a course or program. It doesn't have to be with me, just pick someone that resonates with you, right? But this is a great place to practice this because there's other people that want to practice the same thing. So that's the first thing. The second thing is something I don't really have personal influence on, but this is the broader ecosystem that we have. Because what I've noticed is that we don't have a lot of spaces that support connection, right? Most public spaces where people get together are places where we need to consume something, right? We need to buy alcohol or we need to buy, like if you're in a mall, we need to buy stuff, And I think I could only think of the library as a public place that you can be without spending money, right? So I think our public spaces need to become more safe and more supportive for people to find connection. And this is not my expertise, so I'd be super curious if anybody knows more about that. And lastly, and I think this is more importantly, we need to decondition from these ideas that society has taught us. And for that, I found a method that is extremely successful. It's called EFT tapping. I'm a certified practitioner in that. And what I found is that this method has been scientifically proven to help with chronic PTSD. It's been used with war veterans, so for pretty serious issues. And what it does is you're regulating the nervous system by tapping certain points on the body that have that miraculous effect of regulating the nervous system. And as you're doing that, you're stating new beliefs and you rewire your brain to trust those new beliefs. The brain doesn't really like change, even if it's more healthy. So the brain just wants things to keep things the same, right? So we need to do something extra to believe new things and to start new behavior and to feel safe in that. And so that is what EFT tapping does. And so I created two separate videos depending on what gender you are raised as. So it's okay if you don't no longer identify as that gender, you probably still have conditioning from it. So I would still do the video that fits with the gender you were assigned at birth, and that will help you rewire it. So I'm pretty sure that you'll find a big effect of that. Please let me know in the comments. I would also love to hear what is your specific experience because, I talked about certain things that might be different depending on your culture. For example, male touch, I know, for example, in some Mediterranean countries and some Arabic countries as well, is very different. So please let me know all those nuances and details and how you experience loneliness in the comments. And give this video a like and thumbs up if you'd like to see more of this. And if you would like this video to go out to more people, that will be a huge help for me as well. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope we can change this shit. All right, see you next time. Bye bye.